Hello, HIN 620. We are moving to Chapter 6 and making a grand leap from scalar calculations to aggregate calculations. So in other words, no longer are we simply operating on a single value, but more on a series of values at this point. Now, let's not get too far ahead, and it's not that we're never going to operate on single values again, because that's very important and happens, a majority of the time. But also, it's important to understand the aggregate queries too, and to understand the aggregate queries from the basic level. You take a look at the average, sum, min, and max commands, as well as the count, which is something we've already used before anyway. And you can see that, if you had 10 numbers that were in a particular column in a table, you'd say, well, just, select the average of that, and it would average up all the values in that column and give you out a single number. So that's one form of aggregate queries. But as we go forward in this chapter, we'll see some more complex ways of doing that, using the group by and halving, and also the additional with rollup command. So I think that the best way to do this is, even though this is in the book and on the slides, I think if we just kind of walk through how the basic query grows from a simple group by to a more complex group by to one that uses the halving command, I think that'll help. So if we look at the basic command here of just selecting the vendor ID and how many invoices you want from the invoices, and group it by vendor ID. So in other words, it's going to show you the total number of invoices by the vendor. So it's grouped by the vendor. So if we run that, we see that there's 34 rows, and that's because there's 34 vendors, and shows each quantity of invoices that it has. And while that's useful information, it's probably not terribly useful information, because there are probably very few situations where you want the data to look like this, if for no other reason than printing out the vendor ID doesn't really help you any. You really want what the vendor name is, at least, if not where they're located. So if we move on to the next phase of this and see how we add in vendor state and the vendor city, because that's what we want to group by, so they have to be in the select command. And then we add in a aggregate function to average the invoice total and round it to 2 digits. And then we're still doing the same stuff from the vendor table. So let's run this and see how we get better information, because we're now seeing it's sorted by state, and it's with the state within the city, and then how many invoices they have, and then the invoice average. Now the data is getting there. This is really much more data that you can make decisions on, and kind of see what's going on, and analyze your business or your health informatics. So if we go to the next step, we're then looking at a query that has the same commands, except it has the addition of the halving count greater than 2. So this is the same count as the invoice quantity. So if we run that, remember we had 20 rows before. If we run that now, we have 12 rows, and this shows only the ones where the invoice quantity is greater than or equal to 2. So the ones that only had 1, which you may dismiss as anomalous data or something like that. I'm just trying to give you the rationale for doing that. They would be gone from this report. So that kind of shows you the effect that expanding on the group by and then adding the halving on there. And the halving, you'll note, for something that we'll discuss a little later, is halving is sort of different than where. So we'll look at that a little bit later. And then Another thing that was discussed was the um, roll up, which gives you a summary row. And so this is not really building off the commands we had before, but just giving you a good example of what the with rollup means. So the with rollup is creating a summary row for each grouping that you have in your table. Now for this example, there's only one grouping because you're only grouping by vendor ID. But at the end of that, when we run the command, you'll see that there is a summary row. And so it fills in the vendor ID with null. And then there's 114 invoices, and this is the invoice total for all of them. So that's something that could come in handy at some point as well. So you get the total of everything you're grouping on. So one other thing the book talked about was the difference between using the where and the having keywords in your query, how they will give you different results. And I think the example they have in the book is very good for showing this, because you're looking at this grouping of the average of the invoice total being greater than 500. So you want like the aggregate to be greater than 500. And so you run that and you see there's all this, and every invoice average here is greater than 500. The closest one is this 503. But now watch the Zilka design here, which has 8 invoices and an invoice total of that. And then we'll see how that changes as we change from having to aware. Sorry. Okay, and then we run it again, and now the Zilka design has 7 invoices and invoice average of 946.67. And the reason that is because one of the invoices was less than 500, and that's where this where is different than the having, because the where operates on each row at a time rather than operating on an aggregate. So as long as any rows that were less than 500 were removed so that the aggregate no longer included them. So that's the difference between having and where. I hope that walking through that example helped you out a little on that. Next, we'll move on to working through a couple of the exercises. So let's look at exercise 6.3, which says write a select statement that returns one row for each vendor that contains the 3 columns. And so the 3 columns are the vendor name, the count, the invoice count. So let's we'll do a count star and then name it invoice count so we can use it again later. And then the sum of the invoices from the invoice table. So we'll do that aggregate function there and then call it the invoice total sum. So that's, I dare say, the easy part, because you're just kind of doing what it says to do. And then you want to grab the stuff from the vendors table and the invoices table. So you do the standard join that we've learned before. Then here's the stuff we learned here, which is says, okay, group it by vendor name. In other words, I just want this to be listed in a table such that all these numbers are associated with a vendor and each vendor. And then the final part was to order it by the invoice count in descending order, so from the highest number of invoices to the least. So if we run it, we get the vendor names in the left side, how many invoices it had, and then the total. And so you can see interesting things like, MyLove Lithographing had only 5 invoices, and their total was higher than FedEx, which had 47 invoices. So it's just, again, a cool way of being able to analyze the data. Now we can run through 6-6, where we're going to create a select command that answers the question, what is the total amount invoiced for each general ledger account number, and then use the with rollup to show the grand total. So again, if you kind of walk and talk through it, it asks you to select the account number, and then you're selecting the sum of the line item amounts, and then you're doing that from the line item table, so we don't even have to join another table here. You're grouping by account number because that's how you want to see the data. and then you add with rollup, which will add the sum onto the end of it. So if we run that, you see that we have all these count numbers with all their totals, their sums, and then in the end we have the total of all of these guys. And there you go. That's it. I'll see you in the next chapter where we learn how to code subqueries.